I was flying home at the end of a day. Oh, thank goodness that's over. And there was a most almighty bang, and he hit me.
It seemed to be never stopping and was very frightening some of the time.
My only object in life was to shoot as many of the buggers down as possible.
It's a very queer sensation. You just fall through the air. And my face started to hurt a little bit, so I took my mask off, and of course the chamois leather on the face mask was burnt, and I looked down and saw I had no trousers on.
We've got to get in close and fire as little as possible, but effectively as possible.
I didn't want to be in the PBI, the infantry, and I thought, well, if there's going to be a war, the best thing to be is a fighter pilot. So I joined up in the RFVR.
It was arranged for us to go and do some flying with a company, and we flew in tiger moths. And I got an introduction, and they said, well, why don't you come over to England and go to the Air Ministry, and we'll see if we can get you into the RAF.
Well, I always wanted to fly since I was a small boy, and joining the Air Force was the cheapest way of learning to fly that I know. It didn't cost me anything, and in fact, they started to pay me.
It was going to be biplanes with pilot and air gunner, you see. So I said to him, I'd like to be an air gunner, sir. See? And he said to me, he laughed, and he said, I don't think you'd see over the scarf ring. And I thought, what the so-and-so is the scarf ring? But I said, yes, I will, sir, yes, I will. I'll see over that. And it sort of shook him a bit, and he said, all right, Clark, you could be an air gunner.
No training we had was suitable for what arose. We had these various number 1, 2 and 3 attacks which were taught, even when in March, when we first got our Spitfires. There hadn't been any war since the First World War, and the thought was that Spitfires and 109s were so fast that you couldn't have the sort of dogfights you'd had in the First World War. But apart from that, nobody gave a thought, it seemed to me, that the German fighters and our fighters would come against each other at all, because Germany was too far from England for the two to meet. Because of the Maginot Line, I suppose, nobody gave a thought before the war that they'd just march across.
It's not generally realised that most men at that time, youngsters in business, felt obliged to join one of the territorial armies. And I wanted to join the Honourable Artillery Company because they had horses. And when the horses went and they took tanks over, I then saw an advert one day, learn to fly and serve your country, so which I did. And as soon as I started flying airplanes, I realised that was the world I wanted to join.
This is a great thing about a fighter squadron in war. It's a very tight community, from the ground crew, who look after the fitter and a rigger. Each aeroplane had its own. That was their aeroplane, and you were permitted to fly it.
We still consider ourselves to be as good as anybody else, as good as any of the 109 pilots that we would meet, which we didn't very often, and that we could look after ourselves.
The good fellowship between pilots in a squadron is something that is absolutely unique. Any one of us would have done anything for anybody else.
We had a great CO there, it was called George Denham. He was a bit older than the rest of us, a bit like a father figure, but why could he fly? He could fly and he could lead. And everybody, he was held down the greatest regard by his pilots.
Being together, didn't want to go in anybody else, Forget them. No other squadron, just 92 together. We'd lived and fought and played very hard.
The squadron was your, if you like, your home. We felt very much that it was part of our very existence. And we loved being part of a unit.
We had to drive ourselves. And when you were in a squadron, you knew who you could trust and you knew how to get other people to behave. And it became a very strong unit. And of course, you're in the mess, you drank together, you knew each other.
Actually, it was daunting because they were a well-known front-line Royal Air Force squadron with some excellent pilots. And I was very humble because I realised that I was only a number, really, just making a team up. More like in cricket, you have a long stop who stands behind the wicket-keeper. That was my sort of job. And I was just making the numbers up because, quite frankly, I hadn't got a clue. Let's be honest about it. Coming straight from a training school to there. And the squadron commander realised that because I think I only did about 3 trips with 32. And he said, you were 3 of us. He said, you 3 pilots, you 3 sergeant pilots are useless. I can't have you here. And he sent us to Sutton Bridge to continue our training where we flew Hurricanes in training.
We didn't fly initially with any sort of overall, except the ones we bought ourselves. I bought one for £1, I think, before the war, and I wore that as often as I could. We used to be provided with the Sidcut suit, which is a great big clumsy affair, designed really for open-air cockpits with fur around your neck and that sort of thing, which we didn't wear. And we were also provided what we call goon skins or Sidcut suits, which were far too bulky. And we then were provided with goon skins with things that went over our heads, which were ridiculous, because when you turned your head to look behind you, all you did was to disappear into the fur behind the hood.
You've got to realise too that the Hurricane and the Spitfire were new aircraft. We had been flying biplanes up till then, and the whole concept of the aeroplane was landing wires and flying wires holding the wings up, whereas the monoplane, as it was a single wing aeroplane. And we had to learn that. Also, another great thing which happened, which never given enough credit for, is the advent of the Merlin engine. The 1,000 horsepower in those days was unheard of. It meant, for one thing, that we could fly normally through cloud. And I know they used to teach us to fly on instruments a lot, but one did avoid it if you could. Holes in cloud became very popular.
If you're asking me which of the 2 I would prefer to go to war in, it was the Spitfire, because it was the most delightful aeroplane to fly. You didn't get in it, you strapped it on. And it was a friendly aeroplane, wouldn't let you down.
I taxied out past the Spitfire up on its nose and took off. Bloody marvellous. You felt you'd been flying it all your bloody life.
A lovely aeroplane. It was lovely to fly, but it had 2 disadvantages. Well, one disadvantage, which one could see in 2 different occasions. One was that if you tried to pull up after you'd landed, because you were short of runway or grass, whatever it was, many people tipped up in the nose because the centre of gravity was so near the wheels. The other thing was that you couldn't see straight ahead on the ground at all. And people happened to collide with other people. And in the air, the disadvantage was that you really couldn't, if you had to take a deflection shot of anything like 15 degrees or more, you wouldn't be seeing it. If you were taking a correct shot, you wouldn't be seeing your target at all, because it would be underneath the nose. The amount of lead you'd have to give on it would be underneath the nose. And there again, I think that one reason why Hurricane pilots perhaps scored as many as they did compared with Spitfires, that they could see what they were shooting at, where the Spitfire pilot couldn't unless he was more or less behind.
It was a completely new aircraft to us, new concept of flying too. We had to learn it. We had to learn this tremendous power which we had in front of us. But the takeoff on a Hurricane, in those days we had fixed two-wing props, no variable pitch propellers. It was a very long takeoff, and that used to worry me a bit. Especially in those days we had flame trap troubles, which, not generally known today, meant the engine cut out about once every 4 or 5 takeoffs. She cut out for a few seconds, then picked up again. You hoped.
Sitting in the Hurricane, you were higher up and you got a good view forward for taking off or landing. It was a very stable aircraft. It could take a lot of punishment. It could take a lot of machine gun bullets through the fuselage and the wings and still fly.
The nearest comparison I can give you is the Hurricane was a thoroughbred horse and the Spitfire was the racehorse. That tells you everything. And the Spitfire was the most beautiful thing to fly. But I think for my fighting, and thank God most of my fighting was done in Hurricanes, I'd rather have the Hurricane. Because when you're in a dogfight with an enemy trying to shoot at you, you do awful things to an aeroplane, things the aeroplane was never designed for. Because it's far better to live, come back again.
We knew that the Hurricane versus the 109, what was the best altitude, and the best altitude was about 10,000 feet as far as we were concerned, and that's the height that we flew at. And what we knew with the Hurricane was that if caught out, if you went around in circles, you could fly out of range and keep out of range.
I mean, at Croydon, we'd take off as a squadron because it was a grass airfield. So you get all 12 airplanes lined up right across the airfield. Wonderful sight. And all 12 Hurricanes would get airborne at the same time. So and then form up into your 4 Vics and climb up together. So it was quite efficient in that respect, but not as good if there were 109s about.
Heinkels, where we saw a lot of them, were difficult to shoot down, and we always felt that the Hurricane did not have a heavy enough gun. The 303, we had 8 303s firing 20 rounds a second per gun. They were all armor-piercing and armor-piercing incendiary, and you could see these exploding on the aircraft's wings, but a lot of the time they did not appear to be doing any damage.
The 8 machine guns that we had with the Hurricanes and Spitfires out in the wings there, they had to be harmonized, and there were 2 harmonizations that were discussed by ourselves and by the armourers. One was spot harmonization, to get as many bullets into one small area as possible, or to spread the overall area.
The guns on a Spitfire or Hurricane only last about 13 seconds. So you tended to fire in 1 second or 2 second bursts. That's the golden rule. You get rid of an awful lot of ammunition. You get a lot of rounds off in that time. You had 2,400 rounds roughly. It's about 300 rounds per gun, and that used to go out about 13 seconds. But an awful lot of lead flies out in that time, provided you get it aimed at the right place, provided you're close enough. These facts have all got to be always borne in mind.
If you see him, turn inside, and you'll always be able to turn inside more quickly than the Hun. And get up higher, he must be higher, and then preferably in the sun, as far as he was concerned. And if you were attacked, once the bullets flew, get out of it. Get out of the way, I should say. Not get out of it, get out of the way.
The first time I fired my guns in anger was at 150 plus Heinkels over Maidstone. And that was the first time that I started to know what it was all about.
But probably the one disaster area in combat at that time, and I'm talked about when I was with 41 Squadron, was they used to have a weaver, top and bottom, who was normally a sergeant pilot. And you would weave and give top cover to the squadron. But to keep up with them and weave, you were losing more petrol than they were. And suddenly the squadron leader would turn off in one direction and you'd turned off in another. So then you had to go straight, fly straight and level to try and keep up, which was a rather hazardous procedure.
The form was that when you took off, you joined up, and there were 2 flights, and each flight had 6 aircraft, so there were 4 threes, so to speak. In the event, there'd be 3 threes in line astern, and 1 in the box, and 2 of that last would be weaving above, trying to keep up a little bit ahead, and they'd be watching your tail. And I think in '92, if I'm not right, we continued with that well into the Battle of Britain.
The Germans' tactics were good, and we'd been taught to fly World War I tactics of tight formations of Vic to show that we were well disciplined in the air, I suppose, as much as anything. Actual fact, it was a recipe for disaster. We could have been killed, and we were, picked off. The Germans used to pick us off one by one. We weren't looking behind us.
The first Spitfires, believe it or not, had ring and beads, even in the First World War. But then we had the reflector sight, which was really a more up-to-date presentation of the ring and bead. But people couldn't hit anything as a result of deflection shooting to save themselves. And the only way to hit anything is to get directly behind the other chap, as close as you possibly can, close your eyes and fire. It's very little more than that.
And one object of combat was to get behind the aircraft, which wasn't always easy. And I suppose if you failed, all you did is to make certain no bugger on your tail could get at you. That was the number one for me.
We had to get into about 250 feet, which is very close and fairly bumpy because you got into the slipstream of these things. But that was the only doctrine we got: get in close and fire as little as possible, but effectively as possible.
Man, I was able to pull my guns into one point, and the nearest I get without hitting the wingtips was 167 yards. I do know that. They come onto one point. And I did this because I reckon the only way to make a kill was to get really close. In one case, I shot a Heinkel 111 and suddenly burst of oil. I thought I'd blown my own engine up. And when my fitter and rigger got to clean it up afterwards, I landed fairly quick, they found it was German oil from the Heinkel 111's oil tanks had blown up and come into my aeroplane. It gives some idea how close we were.
Knowing your aircraft and what it was capable of was one of the primary requirements of a good fighter pilot.
Height is essential. Don't hang around in the skies, congratulating yourself and so on. Never fly straight and level in the combat area. Get in, hit the bombers hard and get out again. Don't hang around. And keep your eyes open all the time. That's about the basics of the thing. And if you did that, then you stood a better chance of getting away with it.
The technique was, as the 109s dived down on you, you did an inverse turn. You put your foot across and you did a flick roll. And that almost immediately meant that the Messerschmitt was then in front of you. And I shot down 2 Messerschmitts that way.
In those days we used to be called at 3:30 in the morning, breakfast at 4, when you really feel like having breakfast, and then it was down to dispersal.
In the end, you didn't think about it, you were tired. I could always see dawn readiness. I can see the Spitfires standing in the gloom at dispersal. I can hear the airmen and the clank of petrol bowsers, and I can remember sort of looking up at the sky and thinking, oh, it's going to be a lovely day again. Oh God, another dawn,
Readiness started at daybreak or dawn, and the first squad raids were never known to be mounted up that early. So one flight would be detailed to go on readiness at dawn.
It was a funny sort of time. You just sort of fool around. I think we had a football we knocked around with.
When we were in North Weald especially, we used to get a lot of information from sector ops on the state of the enemy, because the enemy was taking off in northern France, and of course the bombers used to take about an hour to get to height. So they would gradually form up over northern France or northern Belgium, and it would appear on our radar screens or sector's radar screen. We used to get that information, and that was really the most apprehensive part of our flight. The fighters took off a little later because they then had to form up before they could come across to England. So it was the period before the fighting that when we were having these messages passed to us to what was happening, 20, 30, 40, 50, 100 plus, 150 plus, my God, and there are only 12 of us, sort of thing, where do we start? And eventually we'd be scrambled. Now, as soon as we're scrambled and the fighting started, you didn't give it a thought. Well, at least I never gave it a thought anyway. I was too busy avoiding the blokes flying next to me and looking for the enemy and getting out of the way of the ack-ack, because the ack-ack used to come up in sheets all over the place, and as often as not we'd be hit by our own ack-ack, and just as often as we were hit by the enemy. But no, the actual business of fighting is the easiest part of it.
It was the tenseness of the actual operation, and I suppose in many ways the waiting was worse than the actual action, because when you're in action you've got something to occupy yourself.
It was difficult for the southeast early on, but once the enemy began, they thought the best way of flying was to get massive squadrons of bombers and fighters together, and this meant that they had to collect on the other side of the channel, and our radar was sufficiently good to be able to see this going on. So we had time to get up, but not to get straight into the fray. And although 11 Group, which I was in, had to get up and into the fray as soon as possible, 12 Group, although they buzzed because they didn't get into the fray straight away, they did have the opportunity, if they were sent off, to fly back and gain height and then get at them either over London or on the way home again.
Tea time on a Sunday. I don't know why. The Germans used to love that. Tea time, they used to mass up. We could see them forming up on their, well, our radar boys could see them and they used to tell us, oh, they're forming up now. And they used to start their bomber formations over the coast of France. We used to see them over there from our talk. And then we used to finish off our tea, get near our aircraft, and we'd take off ready, and when the scramble, when we were told to, and told to go. In our main thing, it was over Weymouth, of all places, because that's where the Navy had its oil tanks.
We looked forward to the second breakfast, and the tea, when the naffy arrived, you were sitting there really dreading the telephone ringing. Sometimes just to tell you that the naffy had arrived, but more often than not it was a scramble.
We'd be usually up at first light, out to the dispersal, and the aircraft would be warmed up by the ground crew, and you would sit around awaiting instructions. And the telephone would ring, so you'd all be on the alert.
Waiting for that telephone to ring was the most exhausting part of being a fighter pilot during the Battle of Britain. When it rang, the message may be, the NAFI's here with tea, which was you enjoyed the tea, but somewhat shattering. When it rang and you were scrambled, it was a wonderful relief. Once you were strapped in the aircraft, in it, then you felt, we're on our way, we're doing something.
You would hear a chap answering the phone. No, Corporal Smith has gone to breakfast, he's not here, I'm afraid. Put the phone on, you would all relax. And this would happen so frequently, we'd say to each other, God, when this war's over, I'm not going to have a damn telephone in my house.
The fitter and the rigger were there, and with the starter battery alongside, plugged into your aircraft.
A chap would suddenly shout, holding the telephone in his hand, 32 Squadron, Patrol, Ashford, Angels 15.
Immediately you got the scramble, you just probably ran about 30 or 40 yards, jumped into the aircraft, pulled your parachute on, and within possibly 2 minutes you were taking off.
I used to put my parachute in the cockpit with the harness over the back of the seat.
It used to go on the port wing, which is just as well because you walk up and under it, grab the two straps, pull away, it fell over on your back, bit came round here, you click, click, bit bent down, strap between your legs, and then click, click, and you're finished.
On occasions, of course, we did sit in the aircraft. We were brought to what they called readiness, sitting in your aircraft. And we were sitting there with the parachutes on, helmets on, and just sitting there as I'm sitting here now, sitting in the aircraft. And then you get the signal to scramble. There's suddenly a very pistol would fire a signal, the light would go up and you'd go off.
Sometimes it would be a flight or section takeoff, a flight, or even a squadron takeoff. And you were concentrating on, well, getting out onto the airfield, getting into formation, taking off, settling down and formating on your section, flight commander and so on, wondering what the hell was going to happen, because you didn't know. I mean, every time you scrambled, you didn't know whether you were going to get involved in action or not, and quite often you didn't. But the feeling was always there that life was going to get a bit dicey.
Fear, as we all know, is the unknown. So as you got more experience, the fear to some extent diminished. But with the average pilot, I don't think ever lost fear, because no one wanted to die.
It was awful. No other word to put it. You suddenly found yourself up against enormous odds. I'll give you one example. 6 of us ran into 40 WWII one day. We shot down 14 of them, and they ran off. Now, as we left, we were out of ammunition, another 150 87s came in. It was that thing. We were never overawed by the Germans. We were certainly outnumbered.
You seem to got a lot of calls where someone would say, a section wanted over at so-and-so. So we'd take off and fly over so-and-so, and fly up and down looking, and then eventually they'd say, no, forget it, it's all finished.
It depended on the fighter controller, and they varied greatly in skills in being able to manoeuvre their squadrons into the right position.
It was always going in from the front, and we saw in the distance you'd see a big black cloud. It looked like a thunderstorm, but it actually was a formation of probably 200 German bombers coming in. Above them you could see the 109s as they were turning and twisting above the bombers to protect them. And he would take us in on these head-on attacks, which we hoped we could get there before the 109s would come down onto us to protect their bombers, and invariably we would, because we'd go in a head-on attack. You'd go straight through the bombers, you'd fire your guns. If there was any knockdown, of course the senior blokes would claim them, and down you'd go. That was it. You'd then be attacked by these 109s, and it was a matter of looking after yourself then. It was every man really for himself then.
It's that you're destroying an enemy aircraft. They have to be destroyed because they're flying over your country. That is the feeling. You don't think of the 10 men or 6 men in the aeroplane. In fact, if you did, perhaps you would be so keen about it.
When you first saw several hundred bombers blackening the sky and a horde of fighters sitting on top of them, and so then, of course, Squadron Commander would lead in to attack the bombers. We would follow, by which time the German fighter escort had come down and started getting mixed up with us. So you finished up trying to kill them as they tried to kill you, and you didn't get much chance at the bombers. Not as we were always the number 2 flight to attack, because A flight, which the CO led, they'd go in first and B flight were left to follow. So only occasionally did we manage to break through and get a shot at the bomber formation.
Well, what happened was, you see, normally you went in to attack the bombers, which was a large formation. You shot down one, if you could, leader, if possible, of a section, because that did win the war in the end. We didn't know at the time, but we shot down, and as you were doing that, one of their escorting fighters would come onto you, and then you peel off to have your own private fight. And it wasn't, sometimes there were 2 or 3 of them. You had to get out of that.
Well, then again, my own experience was that they just dove away. I don't remember having a dogfight that lasted very long, because eventually you'd get on his tail and then he'd dive away, you see. In fact, my experience of generally of 109s is that they always wanted to get away, funnily enough. They didn't want to engage. So you were either caught yourself and didn't have much option, or you had a few moments, or you caught him without being seen, or you got a shot or 2 and then away you went. And you'd be very lucky if you could, if you're already behind, be able to catch up. I had several occasions, full bore going down, and sometimes occasionally getting a little bit nearer, mostly not being able to.
We were jumped by some 109s out of the sun. This is this type formation business and so on. And the first we knew about it was a frantic shout, break, 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 which meant you didn't, as I say, you didn't sit around arguing, you just broke, and I broke down, and the 109s came down on us and shot down a chap, damaged somebody else, and I went down and pulled out of the dive and looked around as naturally there, and then ahead of me was a 109 flying straight and level and heading south, going home, and whether he saw me I don't know, but I got straight behind him and shot him down. He could have been one of the ones that had attacked us and had done this, thought, well, it's all over and done with now, I'm going home. And as I say, no matter which side you were on, you couldn't afford to relax.
The sky's very large, you know. It's very large, the sky, because you see these things going on 1 minute, 20 seconds later you wouldn't see an aircraft for some reason. Or only the big black cloud of the bombers, you'd see those going on. But the sky would empty very quickly.
It's certainly true that when you go into combat for the first 2 months, you are very vulnerable.
When I first went into battle, I was on a very steep learning curve. I was learning to fly the aircraft and endeavouring to learn how to shoot. And certainly on my earlier flights, someone would shout on the radio, break, that meant we were being attacked. And I broke a steep turn, left or right. And I found myself completely alone in the sky, not even an enemy aircraft in sight, let alone any of my rest of the squadron.
The sort of business when you come up through cloud, without looking around, you know that there are 12 aircraft around you, even without seeing them. and you're conscious of the fact that you're aware of what's going on.
As the war progressed, I'm talking about during the Battle of Britain now, one became more aware. And it was during this period of complete, almost ignorance of not knowing what was happening, to becoming aware, where of course you lost the most pilots. If you got over that steep learning curve, you stood a far better chance of survival.
Some people are temperamentally unsuited to fighting. You have, in any squadron, you have groups of people. You have people who are very good at it, people who are not so very good at it, people who are never aware of what's going on around them, and people who just don't want to fight. Those people just disappeared. Nobody made a fuss about it, they just disappeared.
I remember flying back when I'd finished my ammunition at some 1,000 feet or so back towards Biggin, and it was the only occasion, I think, that I really felt a thrill about the affair. I thought, I've done it, I've got some bastards. And that was it. The rest of fighting wasn't a particular thrill, but I felt that I'd done something.
At the late stage in the Battle of Britain, we were privy to the orders that were going out to the Luftwaffe overnight for the next day's raids. And if we'd made absolutely full use of that, they couldn't give the game away. So what they did was this Jim Crow flight.
The unit that I had volunteered to join was called the Jim Crows. Now, we started off with Hurricanes first, and our job was that as soon as the radar that existed saw activities in France, they called on us to take off, to intercept these formations, and to give as much information back to 11 Group as to the formation, the numbers, the heights, and the directions. We were sent off in pairs to think, and it was a very hairy one because everybody liked the look of two airplanes by themselves, both the Royal Air Force and the German Air Force, and we were being attacked the whole time by either one or the other, and having to verify that we were either friendly or unfriendly to whoever was attacking us. So we had to keep our eyes firmly open, but none of us were ever shot down. We were too experienced for that.
I took off from Biggin with the first sight or blips on the radar to go and fly up and down just off our coast to see if I could see when they began to move and send that back, and that would give some better idea than the radar. I suppose not to attack anything, because my job was to do that. Why not pairs? I don't know. That was in the middle of June, July, something like that. So off I went, scrambled, climbed up to 25,000 feet, tooled up and down. I did see two 109s, which I reported there about 1,000, 2,000 feet below. They'd seen me and they started manoeuvring to come up. So what could I do about that except to go down and get one of them? So whether that affected the result, I don't know. At least I had reported them, but I didn't stay up there to report the numbers of bombers, etc.
We were going happily along, and suddenly, thump, 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 tracers coming through. I have recollections that seem to me of tracers coming under my armpits and going out through the front of the aircraft. Then suddenly there was a smell of oil and cordite. This is why I think the gunner must have got a burst off when I think back at later. And that was it. Suddenly my engine just stopped.
There I was, 1 minute, shooting, and had the button pressed for, I know, nice good long burst, about 3-4 seconds. And the next thing I knew was, there I was in midair, and all I could see of the aircraft was a wing fluttering down as if it was a leaf.
And as I dived underneath him, all his perspex had broken away and both his engines were on fire. And as I dived underneath, I thought, that's great, till I realized he had put one bullet through my spinner and my engine was failing. I looked down and saw a large field. We were told, don't bail out. Always land if you can.
My plane was shot to pieces, and I had to bail out. And I tried to jump. I hope they wouldn't try to jump. But I was still plugged into the radio.
I thought, God, you know, I'm going to go into the water. I've got to get out of here quickly. And for some stupid reason, I undid my straps, thinking, oh, we're going to hit the water and I've got to get out quickly. Well, obviously I hit the water, all right. The next thing I knew was I was in black water. It seemed to be black water. I'd obviously been knocked out and the airplane had sunk and I was well down in the water. But I was able to get myself out of the thing and I could see that it was just, I could see light above and I managed to get myself to the top. And then I thought, well, the blood all around the place. And then I realised the side of my face was hanging down here because that had happened. Well, then I blacked out again.
And I was in the water for quite a while. Again, there's a cloud above, no idea which direction was which, even no sign of land, no idea which direction I should swim, if I should, or whether I should even bother. I didn't really think I should even bother, there didn't seem to be any point. And then over the horizon appeared the hull of a vessel. And I quite soon realised that it was a German vessel. They had flying a German flag. Anyway, they took me aboard. And I was greeted by a junior officer. For you, the war is over. He was quite right. It was.
I'd got the canopy open. It was all ready with the canopy open. All I did was pulled the clip, lifted myself up and out. I came like a cork out of a bottle. I didn't have to climb out. You didn't climb out of Hurricanes or Spitfires, fighter aircraft. You just eased yourself out of the seat and the slipstream of the aircraft would pull you straight out.
And I had to clue where I was because it was 10 tenths cloud. And it wasn't until eventually I got through the cloud that I realised that I was over the sea.
So as I went down, I could see the coast drifting further and further away. I finished up, as I landed in the sea, about a mile offshore.
And I landed in this enormous field, jumped out of the cockpit, and a bloke was rushing up at me with a pitchfork saying, I'm going to kill you, you bloody German. And he rushed at me and was chasing me round the Hurricane when fortunately the army arrived.
Unhappily, my aeroplane was lost because my friend Green was shot down. He came down by parachute too, but the army did a better job on him. They killed him. So when he fell into somebody's back garden and he died in somebody's arms.
Wind got into the parachute and carried it away. And then I had to blow up keep myself above water. I had to blow up the May West. No CO2 bottles in those days. All compressed air bottles. Blowing and blowing and blowing, nothing was happening. Realised the bladder of the May West was split. Now what buoyancy I did get was from K-Pock pads inside built into the May West. And there was I with one hand trying to keep myself above water. As I didn't know it at that time, but my right leg was broken in pieces.
I stopped making friends. And that sums it up, because I'd had too many friends killed. And you do stop. You get used to having friends around you, then suddenly they're not there. You see, the chap who was there at breakfast, he's killed an hour later. You never see him anymore. It sounds awfully easy to say that to you now, but to us we were only young kids, we were only 20s, early 20s, many of us. We had lost too many friends.
What we were short of is experienced aircrew, because we lost a lot of people. We lost in 249 Squadron, if you bear in mind that the squadron strength was 23 pilots, roughly. We lost 8 killed and pretty well 15 to 20 badly affected by burns, and as a result of being shot down, wounded and so on. So there was a constant drip of new people in the squadron.
I didn't realise I was part of history. I was just someone trying to do my little bit and survive. And that was it. The bigger picture didn't exist.
The constant bombing, mortal combat, and the threat of invasion. In September 1940, those things were very real indeed, believe me.
We were angry at these Black Crosses dare fly over our country. That's the first rule. And they were bombing our mothers. It makes you get angry. You'd be surprised the aggression you'd find inside you, which comes out in other ways. But our way was this, that we were going to give a good account of ourselves. This is how we felt all the way through.
You knew that the odds were sort of loaded against you, but you hated the Germans so much you were going to kill them before the bastards could kill me. That was the sort of attitude. It was absolute hatred of the Germans.
Morale never went so low as to we ever thought we would lose this battle. It never entered our heads, there's no doubt about that. You felt tired, and we were physically tired.
There were times when you used to think, I've got away with it so far, probably tomorrow I'll get killed. That cropped up in your mind now and again. But have a drink and forget it. And we drank quite a lot.
I suppose I was scared. I think we did our best at the time, and I was lucky enough to survive.
It didn't enter our mind that we had won a battle, because the battle went on, and the war went on, and so on. It's only, as I say, with hindsight, and in the last few years, that people have now starting to say this was the definitive battle of the war.